There is a convention center in your city. It was built or last expanded on the argument that conventions generate hotel nights, restaurant meals, retail purchases, and tax revenue sufficient to justify the public subsidy that financed its construction. The study that supported the subsidy was commissioned by the entity seeking the subsidy, and it projected an economic impact that was almost certainly overstated by a factor of 2 to 4 times the impact that the center actually produced. This is not a regional phenomenon. It is universal. The Convention Center Economic Impact Study is the most systematically overstated document in American public finance. Not because the consultants who produce them are dishonest, though the incentive structure that produces them is designed to generate overstatement, but because the methodology that Convention Center Economic Impact Studies use is structurally incapable of producing an accurate downward estimate. The study methodology treats every convention attendee spending as net new economic activity when a substantial fraction of that spending would have occurred in the city regardless of the convention center's existence. It treats convention business as zero-sum competitive capture from other cities, without accounting for the cost of the competitive positioning required to generate that capture. And it ignores the counterfactual. What would $300 million in public investment have generated if deployed in economic development activities with demonstrated returns rather than in a convention center whose impact the study is about to overstate? The convention center is not the worst investment in American public finance, but it is the most ubiquitous systematically bad one. The infrastructure whose every proponent believes their city is the exception to the national pattern whose evidence is consistent enough to constitute an empirical finding. Subscribe now. Because there are approximately 250 convention centers in the United States, with more than 100,000 square feet of exhibit space, and the economic impact studies for most of them said something similar to what you are about to hear. The convention business in the United States is a finite market whose total demand does not grow proportionally with the supply of convention center square footage that American cities have added across the past 30 years. The total number of conventions, trade shows, and large meetings that occur in the United States each year is approximately fixed by the meeting calendars of the industries and associations that hold them. The American Medical Association holds its annual meeting once per year. The Consumer Electronics Association holds CES once per year. The National Association of Realtors holds its annual convention once per year. The number of annual conventions does not increase because Dallas builds a larger convention center or because Nashville adds a new convention wing. What increases when a city expands its convention center is the supply of convention space competing for the same fixed pool of demand. The aggregate supply of convention center exhibit space in the United States has roughly doubled over the past 30 years. The aggregate demand for that space has grown at a fraction of that rate. The result is a market in which the average utilization rate of American convention centers has declined from approximately 65 to 70% in the early 1990s to approximately 40 to 50% in the contemporary period. A utilization decline that represents not a failure of any individual city's convention strategy, but the predictable market outcome of doubling supply against constrained demand. The Economic Impact Study commissioned to support any individual city's convention center expansion does not model this market dynamic. It models the city's individual opportunity in the national convention market as it exists at the moment the study is commissioned, treating the convention market as sufficiently large to absorb the city's proposed expansion without accounting for the simultaneous expansions that every other city in the competitive set is commissioning studies to justify. The Las Vegas Convention Center expanded by approximately 1.4 million square feet between 2021 and 2023. The Orlando Convention Center expanded by approximately 200,000 square feet in the same period. The Chicago McCormick Place added expansion space. The New York Javits Center completed a $1.5 billion expansion. The expansion was supported by an economic impact study. None of those studies modeled the other expansions. The specific mechanism by which convention center economic impact studies overstate their projections is not methodological malpractice, it is methodological structure. The standard methodology for convention center economic impact analysis is the input-output model, a technique that traces the economic multiplier effects of spending through regional economy, starting with the direct spending of convention attendees and rippling through the hotel, restaurant, retail, and transportation sectors that capture fractions of that spending. The input-output methodology is technically sound when applied to actual economic data. Its application to convention center impact analysis systematically overstates outcomes for three specific reasons. First, the methodology treats all convention attendee spending as new to the regional economy, ignoring the substitution effect, in which some fraction of convention attendees would have visited the city for other reasons absent the convention, and their spending would have occurred regardless of the convention center's existence. Second, the methodology applies standard multiplier coefficients derived from historical economic data to projected attendance figures that are themselves optimistic. If the projected attendance is overstated by 20%, and the multiplier applied to that attendance is drawn from a dataset that includes better attended conventions, the impact estimate is overstated by at least 20% before accounting for any other methodological bias. Third, and most importantly, the study does not model the counterfactual. The $300 million in public subsidy that finances a convention center is not free money. It is either debt that the public must service or revenue that could have been deployed in alternative economic development activities. The study measures the economic impact of the convention center, but never measures the economic impact of the alternative uses of the same $300 million. The convention center looks like a good investment because the study only shows one side of the ledger. The Baltimore Convention Center, the Cleveland Convention Center, the Phoenix Convention Center, the St. Louis Americas Center, the Pittsburgh Convention Center, and approximately 200 other American convention centers built or significantly expanded between 1990 and 2020 were all financed on the basis of economic impact projections that overstated actual outcomes by margins that the publicly available data on convention center utilization and hotel room generation consistently document. The academic literature on convention center economic impact is consistent and has been consistent for 20 years. Multiple peer-reviewed studies have found that the actual economic impact of convention center investments generates returns of 40 to 60 cents for every dollar of public subsidy invested, after accounting for debt service and the opportunity cost of alternative investment. The impact studies that justify the investments project returns of $2 to $4 per dollar invested. The gap between the projected return and the actual return is not a surprise to the academic community. It is fully documented, peer-reviewed, and publicly available. It is ignored by every city commission that votes to fund a new convention center expansion. Because the study in front of them was commissioned by the entity seeking the subsidy, and because the political incentive to build visible infrastructure whose ribbon cutting occurs within a single term is stronger than the political incentive to cite 20-year-old academic literature about convention center economic impact overstatement. The convention center that is being built in your city is not the exception. The study that says it is the exception was commissioned by the entity seeking the subsidy. The consultants who produced it are skilled professionals operating within a methodology that structurally cannot produce the finding that the convention center is a bad investment, because that finding is not the finding that the client is paying to receive. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication.